Good morning. Welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, number 142 in March 2023. We're Learn with Lorna this week on the life and journals of Constance Astley. So welcome to Learn with Lorna. If you haven't watched before, this is a series of videos telling the stories of the collections held by the Highland Archive Service. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. And we have 4 archive centres across the Highlands of Scotland in Inverness, Portree, Fort William and Wick. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland, which is our umbrella organisation, at no cost to the viewer. And High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, and I'm well aware that times are tough at the moment, but if you're able to do that, it really is appreciated. So this week we are on to our second last Learn with Lorna, focusing on women in the archive collections for this month. This week we're looking at one woman in particular, from our Lochaber Archive Centre, the West Highland Museum's collection, the Arasig papers. Hi Anne, sorry, I'm seeing your message. Pleased to be seeing you live this week as well. Yes, so this week looking at a collection held in the Lochaber Archive Centre. I've spoken before about the West Highland Museum papers, so obviously West Highland Museum in Fort William hold their object collections and we hold their archive collections on their behalf. And one of those is a collection of Arasig papers, and that's where this story comes from, the story of Constance Astley. And I've spoken a little bit about Constance in the past, but I wanted to go into more detail this week. So my thanks this week go to Rory in Lochaber Archive Centre, who when I go through and decide what subjects I want to talk about, sometimes I have to message my colleagues and go, can you do some research for me? So Rory did this research for me to be able to write this one, so thank you to him. Constance Charlotte Astley was born in January 1851. She was the second child of Francis Dukenfield Palmer Astley, good name, Francis Dukenfield Palmer Astley, and Gertrude Emma Jones. Constance's mother, Gertrude, suffered with poor health, and in the 1840s and 50s, her husband, so Constance's father, purchased the Arasig estate with an aim that might, moving his wife there, might be beneficial to her health. So Arasig, for those who don't know, on the west coast of Scotland, in Lochaber, a very beautiful part of the country. The estate was some 18,000 acres, and Francis set about commissioning the famous architect Philip Webb, who was a partner of William Morris, to design a new country house on the estate. And that turned out to be the only Scottish country house that Webb did design. The house is absolutely beautiful. It is in a stunning location. All the main rooms were positioned so that they looked over Loch Nanuva. So they look over the loch and over the Moidart coast, and it's really very beautiful. So when we're finished here, do go and have a look at the Arasig house images. They're quite beautiful. Now, prior to purchasing Arasig, the family had held land in the Lake District and in Cheshire. So Dukenfield, just outside Manchester. If anyone is in that part of the world, you can tell me if you know it. So the place called Dukenfield, and it still has the Astley Arms, the Astley Sports Club, the Astley Astley Street, things like that. And they were a family of, amongst other things, creatives and artists. So they moved in a lot of artistic circles, and you might remember me talking about that when I spoke about artists in the collections. I could have told you lots of interesting things about the whole family, but I'm really just going to be talking about Constance and her siblings. So Constance's mother, Gertrude, her poor health brought an end to her life in 1862, and only a few years later, Francis, Constance's father, would also die in 1868, and that meant that Constance and her siblings were left with neither mother nor father. Beatrice was aged 10 and she was taken into the care of relatives. Frank, was aged 14 and he went into the army, taking up a commission in the Scots Fusilier Guards. But the oldest children, Gertrude and Constance, and I know I say this all the time, it's that repetition of names always. So there's a girl called Gertrude after the mother, there's a boy called Francis after the father. And the oldest children, Gertrude and Constance, were old enough to live almost independent lives after their parents died. Gertrude was 18 and Constance was 17. So the estates had been owned, of course, by Francis, and then following his death, they passed to the son, Frank. And when Frank came of age in 1874 at the age of 21, he succeeded into those estates, but unfortunately that wasn't to be for long either, as the London Evening Standard reported in August 1880. A telegram from Quebec has been received, announcing the death by drowning of Mr. Francis Dukenfield Astley, Lord of the Manor of Dukenfield, Cheshire, and late Captain of the Scots Fusilier Guards. Mr. Astley recently resigned his commission in the army and in May left on a pleasure and sporting tour of Canada. It is conjectured that he may have fallen overboard from his yacht or have been otherwise accidentally drowned on a coasting voyage. He was born in 1853, and his father having died in 1868, he succeeded to the estate on attaining his majority. The income from the estate is said to be 40,000 to 50,000 per annum. Mr. Astley also owned the Arasaig estate in Inverness-shire. It was later reported that actually what had happened was that he had fallen overboard while trying to shoot the rapids in a canoe. So Frank is 27 when he dies, and the estates then passed to his and Constance's sister, Gertrude, as the oldest child, and she would go on to marry Arthur Nicholson 3 years later in 1883. So by this point, they have lost the two sisters and a younger sister. They've lost their parents and they've lost their older brother, which means that Gertrude now is the owner of the estates, the heir to all the estates. And Gertrude and Constance, even though they owned these estates in Cheshire, decided to settle at Arasaig, and they made that their main home. So Constance's early years, up to the age of about 30, were wealthy and privileged, but also kind of marred with sorrow and loss. Her mother died when she was 11, her father when she was 17, her brother when she was 29. The collection that we hold, that's just a bit of background of where Constance sits in terms of the landed gentry and her kind of status and position. But I want to focus specifically on Constance and her story now. And the papers that we hold, as I mentioned, are part of the Arasaig estate collection. And the collection includes photographs and correspondence, poems and stories and paintings by Constance Charlotte Astley, because she was a talented artist, as well as her wonderful journals that detail her life and her travels through Scotland and England, through Italy and Germany, New Zealand, Canada. And that's what I really want to focus on. The earliest item we have from Constance Astley's papers is from 1872. And it's a journal written when she was around the age of 21. And it describes a holiday on the Ardtornish estate on the Morven Peninsula on the west coast of Argyll, where she stayed with the owners, Gertrude Smith and Alexander Craig Seller. And it's really interesting because in these early journals, Constance writes in the third person. So she describes herself as she and the whole group as they. Whenever she's referring to herself, her sister Gertrude and their friend Flora, who travelled with them on this particular trip, she refers to them as the three Kilkenny cats. Rory said to me that he had really loved immersing himself in these early diaries because they introduce you to Constance's humour and her adventures and her kind of romantic and dramatic spirit. And I totally agree. You can imagine when I've done 140 something of these, some are easier to write than others, some really, really immerse you. And when I started to write my notes for this, I was like, oh my word, she's marvellous. So here are some extracts from that early journey that will illustrate my point. And remember, she's describing herself and her friends in the third person. 9th of October 1872. They devote their minds to doing nothing all day and they succeed wonderfully. 11th of October 1872. The party row across to Ceylon on Mull and they are met on the beach by Laird Mackenzie. The girls are initially frightened by the figure, but their curiosity to see a real laird overcomes their terror and they advance boldly. Later the party calls at the Guthrie home but find that the family are not in, and instead an inhospitable butler offers them no tea. I just love that that's how she would phrase it. 3rd of November 1872. A lovely day, frosty and bright. The loch looks more lovely than it has ever done before. C experiences a strong desire to sit on the shore and contemplate the scene forever, but the two G's forcibly drag her away. 12th of November 1872. The most perfect day, and G and C feel more than ever that they are leaving paradise. After lunch, Gertrude drives with them to Ardtornish House, where they look out for the hateful steamer. She arrives at around 3:30. The sun disappears in a perfect glory of orange light, and the moon rises brighter and brighter, and at last about 6 p.m, the black sea serpent-like monster steams slowly into Loch Allen. The fatal moment has arrived. G and C, maid and boxes get into the boat and are towed away. Gertrude faithful to the last, watching them from the shore. As soon as they get on board, their melancholy thoughts are much aggravated by finding the whole steamer crammed with steerage passengers, cows, sheep and horses. The upper deck is so covered with luggage that they cannot get from one side to the other, and the last strain is added when they find that the deck cabins are taken. They spend about an hour at Craigmere taking in 3 boatloads of sheep. So beautifully written descriptions, but also that constant humour about, the hateful steamer, and it comes up like a black sea serpent to force them away. She's really a lovely writer. The following year, Constance and her sister Gertrude again ventured further afield. This time they undertook a journey across Europe that took in Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Italy, Austria, Germany and Holland. And again, we hold the diaries for this. And I could have shared any number of extracts, but I'm going to pick these 3. All from different countries. I tried to do that to illustrate different things. Switzerland, 4th of June 1873. They are off again, about 8 for Neuhausen. Another boiling day. Such scenery. The Rhine constantly near them and a splendid view of the cathedral as they leave Strasbourg. They stop at Basel for about 10 minutes, but G's only reflections about it are very good salmon, bread and wine. They get to Neuhausen about 5, and at the sight of the falls, G is speechless with admiration. The hotel is on a steep bank just below them, and they can see almost from bed. These are the most delicious woods, all the way down to the water's edge. The colour of the river is undescribable. So some that are just really kind of evocative words, descriptions that make you picture the scene. And some, as I said, are just quite funny. So this is Italy. 28th of June 1873. Botzen, after a day's mountain climbing. Finally to bed, but alas not to sleep. Talking about her sister here, she says, only G is one of the 7 sleepers who could have slept through the everlasting ringing of bells, firing of cannons and yelling of inebriated Botzenites with which our ears were assailed. The bells were of that class which Miss C most aptly describes as seeming not to invite one to church, but more to say, you will definitely go to hell if you don't come. When the bells ceased, the cannon went on, and then when the cannon had gone off, the bells went again. Between 5 and 6, those who had succeeded in closing their eyes were obliged to open them again. This time it was not a noise, but a most violent shaking. The beds shook, the windows shook, till at last the whole house rocked and the bells rang. G, waking for the first time, murmured in an inspired tone, "What on earth is the matter?" To which C replied sulkily, "Only an earthquake. It appears to be the usual thing here, for nobody took any notice." And then an extract from when they're in Holland. The 9th of July 1873, The Hague. In the evening, they are sitting quietly in the salon, and they are invaded by a herd of American tourists apparently in a great state of mind. They all talk at once, and they all talk very loudly, about what they shall have to eat and where they are all to sleep. Finally, one man addresses the astonished waiter. "Me and these 4 ladies will have the big room. I'll have the single house bed, and I'll have each a single bed for each of them." Then, addressing the ladies, "You will be partitioned off, you know." This peculiar arrangement is too much for G's gravity, and she goes into such fits of laughter that she is obliged to rush from the room. And if you're reading that, if you're an American and you're listening to that and going, well, that's not a great description of American tourists, I can tell you that she also says when she's in Italy that there are many, many tourists, and she says the British element is not favourably represented. So you can imagine. Her 1876 and 77 diaries are of trips around the UK, to Cornwall, to London and elsewhere, and again they really showcase her humour in extracts like this from a trip to Cornwall. 9th of April, Palm Sunday. Service in Cathedral in morning, drive in afternoon, after which G and C take a walk, during which the latter runs great risk of being apprehended for trespassing and performs a remarkable feat of agility. 13th of April, we're taken to see Serpentine Quarry. Distracted by the desire to carry off a few tons, we're shown scenes of wreck and disaster. So I have no idea, obviously, what happened on Palm Sunday, that she was almost apprehended but performed a remarkable feat of agility. But you see what I mean, you can't help but smile when you're reading her words. In 1877, Constance travelled to Belgium, again with her sister Gertrude, but this time also with their younger sister, Beatrice. And Constance's diaries, which many of them include, which you can't see as I'm talking, but include some of her paintings and sketches of what she's seeing. They're full of descriptions of scenery, so she will often write about the beauty of what she's seeing, but also about what she doesn't like, as you can probably imagine from the way she writes. So there's one bit where she talks about going into a cathedral, but she's like, it's so over-decorated that I can't even... that she feels like she can feel no peace in the cathedral because it's so overly ornate that she can't feel calm in it at all. But she also describes some traumatic experiences like this one. 18th of April, Antwerp. C returns to a beloved river where she takes a last sketch in about half an hour. She is much depressed by the sad calamity which then befell her on the bridge in the afternoon. Her precious, most beloved 5 shillings and 6pence umbrella found a watery grave in the canal. A hapless seal was being hauled out of a boat, and turning around to look, she kicked the ill-fated Gamp umbrella, which she had laid down very carefully, into the canal. It gave a hollow plunge, and it sank to rise no more. As C had possessed this treasure for at least 2 minutes, the sympathising reader may imagine her grief at losing so old and valued a companion. And then the next day, she says, 19th of April. They breakfasted a little earlier than usual, and C goes to the river to sketch before church. The tide is out, and after taking up her position on the bridge, a sudden thought strikes her, and she goes down in the direction where she saw her beloved Gamp disappear the day before. Can it be possible? A black object meets her gaze, pulled to and fro on the mud by the returning waves. It actually is, the beloved form which she never thought to behold again. Turning to the admiring crowd, she hastens to explain that the object is her property, and an individual speedily descends and rescues the dripping creature for her. Isn't she fantastic? It's worth noting that she's talking there about her desire to sketch. She's sketching as she sees things. She goes out sketching in the morning before she goes to church. And it's interesting to note that throughout these years of her life, and I mentioned her father being friends with Philip Webb and William Morris and co. But Constance throughout her life maintained those kind of connections with the artistic world as well. If you Google her when we're finished, you'll see some paintings done of her by various artists. But also in the collection we hold there are letters from Robert Browning and various other people, Jenny Lind, the singer. Letters from Browning accepting invitations to dinner, to come to events and parties and so on. So while she's having this kind of exotic life, travelling about and having a laugh, she's also really immersed in that world of creativity. Some years later, now aged about 35, Constance took a trip to St Kilda via Skye with Miss MacLeod of Dunvegan and Mr Macpherson Glendale. Now, we don't know, that's all it says, Mr Macpherson and then Glendale in brackets, so could it be the Glendale martyr 3 years after his imprisonment for the role in the Crofters War? Or maybe it's John Macpherson MacLeod, the owner of Glendale. I don't know. But her diary of this trip, interestingly, now not written in the third person anymore, so that was just a thing she did when she was younger. She's now writing in the first person. But her diary describes interesting details about the journey. Very rough and difficult journey to St Kilda, and it notoriously is. I don't know if anyone has been there, but it's notoriously a very difficult and rough journey. But also the many questions and conversations that the people of St Kilda had for Miss MacLeod of Dunvegan, like this. She says, "We found Miss MacLeod having finished her business and then proceeding on a round of visits, distributing sweetmeats everywhere she went. The visits had to be cut short abruptly because of the weather. We hurried back to the boat, accompanied as before by about half the population, all clamouring to have a last word with Miss MacLeod, especially two young men who were most anxious to emigrate and wanted her advice on the subject. They both got most excited, and one was even abusive, as her advice was all against their going, as by doing so they left their parents and womankind without anyone to work for them." So really interesting little insights into, of course, a world at St Kilda that is no longer exists in the same way. The journey that Constance is most famous for now, thanks to her journals being published, is an 1897-1898 journey to New Zealand. And the journals were published but 100 years later to mark the 100th anniversary of that trip. And so you can still buy a copy of this. This journey was undertaken in the company of Margaret Shane, a woman with whom Constance would go on to have a very, very close relationship for years to come. It's commonly believed that with people who have researched Constance's life, that Constance and Margaret were lovers, and that Constance was also the lover of Dorothy Dolla Richmond, who she met in New Zealand. And Dolla also had a female lover, the artist Frances Hodgkins. And it's always an interesting challenge to look at that, because you don't want to retrospectively label people, but on the other hand, if that was an important part of their life, you also don't want to not talk about it. The three of them, Constance, Margaret Shane and Dolla Richmond, seem to have maintained a relationship, quite a complicated relationship, of the three of them in a romantic arrangement over the following decades. And it's not explicitly referred to in our collections, other than things like she describes Dorothy as having the most beautiful eyes and the most sweet face I have ever seen. And we know that a portrait of Dorothy hung in her sitting room for many, many decades. But it's not explicitly referred to in our collections, but it does seem to be explicitly referred to in other family letters held elsewhere. Constance's diaries of this trip are fascinating. They burst with descriptions and are accompanied by her own drawings and Margaret's wonderful photographs. So Margaret Shane was a very talented photographer. Constance is a writer and artist. And so all of this together, if you have a look at the published book, you can see all of that together. And if you're in New Zealand, they also hold copies of all these photographs in the New Zealand National Archives. But I wanted to describe to you how Rory summed this journey up, because the parallels he drew I thought were so beautiful that I'm just going to read you exactly what Rory said to me. "What is apparent in this diary is an excitement felt by Constance to see what can perhaps be described as a real New Zealand, rather than the Europeanised societies of the major towns and cities which bear the influence of British imperial rule. Astley and Shane are drawn to the wilderness, taking in Mount Cook and the Tasman Glacier, and then travelling to the North Island to bathe in the hot mineral pools of Tucano. She expresses delight at seeing Maori people in their traditional dress, and disappointment when they appear to be westernised in their dress. One is reminded here of Samuel Johnson's trip to the Western Isles of Scotland in 1775, his eagerness to see in real life the kilted military wild Highlander, and his fear upon arriving that he'd come too late to see it before it had changed. However, Constance is able to witness a haka, and she describes the leader making the most indescribable grimaces and every now and then giving vent to shouts and noises, which were answered by a terrific yell from the dancers, some of whom worked their faces and rolled their eyes, showing as much of the whites as possible. Right through the trip, Constance writes about her desire to travel in a Maori canoe, and she does eventually manage to do that, being ferried across a river at Huntly. But I thought Rory's parallel there of Johnson's visit because I've read those descriptions of Johnson's where he says that he wants to see the real Highlands, he wants to see the wilderness, and he wants to see Highlanders in their own environment, if that sounds horrible, but you know what I mean. But he writes in his journals, I've come too late, it's already changed. And it was interesting when Rory said it, that same feeling in Constance's diary of going, I've seen Maori people and I've met them and I've seen some things, but I wonder if I've come too late before people were really westernised. Quite interesting. Here are some of the extracts from this journal to give you a feeling of it. Christmas Day 1898, and as I say, she's now writing in the first person. We are finally comfortable in our cabin. I had the most heavenly time after dinner, lying on my back on a bench on a hurricane deck which is not closed in, watching the stars coming out one by one, and the sky changing from a silvery blue-grey to the deep blue of night. There was not a creature there except myself, and I remained spellbound until the whole sky was spangled with stars as if it were the heavenly host. Today was spent in the most complete idleness, and I have been possessed of a futile longing for church bells and hymns. I hope we shall have a service tomorrow. And if anyone has been there, I have stood in a very dark place in New Zealand and seen the Milky Way really clearly, and it is completely extraordinary. 20th of January 1898, Nelson to Wellington. We left dear Nelson with much regret. I think it is a charming place, scarcely a town. We found the boat, the Gorina, very full, but thought we were going to be very comfortable in the social hall, which had been turned into a ladies' cabin. We took the 2 top berths and were allowed use of a lower one to put our things on. We passed Cable Bay and had a good view of the coast till it got dark, which it unfortunately did before we got to the French Pass, and as there was no moon, we saw less of it than last time. A boat came off bringing fish, and the mail came on board tied up with a string of rock cod. We did not go straight back to Wellington, but were to call at Picton, which is at the head of Queen Charlotte's Sound, and were due in there at 1 a.m. We were roused from our brief repose by the influx of numerous females, passengers and their friends, and a fearful amount of talking, making up of beds, etc. I gradually awoke to the consciousness that all of our belongings, including my skirt, which I had rashly taken off, had been removed, and that the locomotion was next to impossible, the floor being strewn with prostrate forms. Come what might, I was determined that I would not be stuck there, so I descended in search of a stewardess draped in M's plaid shawl. After a frantic search among the chaos of objects, animate and inanimate, I recovered various garments, which I hastily donned, and sought the seclusion of the deck in the early twilight. I found Picton to be a most charming place at the head of the fjord. And then finally, 22nd of March 1898, a lovely morning, although it poured and blew in the night. We left Whanganui at 6:30 a.m. and drove a very short way to the river, where we found a little steamer moored alongside the Maori encampment. And we had a little time to observe before the steamer started. One lady was washing her hair most carefully under a tap with what looked like a small canoe under it, in which a portentously stout party was washing something else. Most of them, men and women, had pipes in their mouths, and one saw every variety of costume, except, alas, a pure and simple native blanket. It appears that there has been a concourse of Maori at Whanganui owing to a regatta, which alas we have just missed. I should really have liked to have seen it. I believe that some of the canoes were paddled by 20 or 30 Maori women and men. A lot of the Maori came on the steamer, amongst them a distinguished lady, the daughter of a chief Metikingi, whose deeds of valour are recounted to me. His wife wore shark's teeth in red sealing wax on them as earrings, and was elaborately tattooed about the chin and lips, the latter always stained dark blue. So really interesting to get her stories about that, and there are some fantastic photos that Margaret took, particularly of the Maori that accompany it, and if you have a look at the Lochaber Facebook page, you'll see some of those pictures. From New Zealand, Constance and Margaret returned to England via America and Canada, a very, very long and difficult journey, quite a few months later. She says of that return journey, 16th of May, quite thick, ship almost steady, so the fog is quite thick, ship almost steady, foghorn going occasionally, still feel a wreck but think I must almost be getting to a turning point. It's awfully cold and I'm afraid of going out. I just don't feel like coping with America. What months and years it seems since I heard about anybody. What will I hear at Vancouver? 19th of May 1898. I like Vancouver very much. It is big and simple and not noisy and absolutely unlike any other town I was ever in. There is a great wharf with a few great ships, great sheds full of boxes, no station, no porters. The huge train glides silently in, no noise, no confusion. Mountains and forests all around. This town is only 10 years old and only partly built. And again, I make it sound like I travel around the world all the time. I don't, but I have been to Vancouver, and it is a very, again, a very beautiful description. I would absolutely echo that. A little town, or much bigger now, obviously, but with that, the surround of mountains and forests is quite striking. 3rd of June 1898. My impression of Niagara is different from what I expected, in that beauty, divine, dazzling and majestic, overrides all others. This may be partly due to the time of year and the undoubtedly propitious circumstances for which we cannot be sufficiently thankful. The glorious weather, the spring foliage, the absence of crowds and the moon all combined to heighten the impression of unearthly loveliness and diminish the awfulness which of course one felt was there. I must say I should like to see it in the stormy sky as well. It must be truly awful. And again, awful with that, full of awe. Really interesting that even in that beauty she's going, I can see it's the most striking thing, it's absolutely beautiful, but you can feel that the terrible strength of the water underlying it. She ends this journal with the words, "Au revoir, dear people." Interesting, you wonder who she was writing it for and what a gift it was when it was published 100 years later, that it already felt like it's written for an audience. We don't have later journals, but we know that Constance lived the rest of her life at Arasig. Dolla Richmond visited her there, and Margaret Shane, they had agreed that they would move in together and that they would live permanently together, but that didn't ever happen. But Margaret did spend large periods of time at Arasig. Constance died in 1935, Dorothy died in 1935, and Margaret died in 1936, even though there was a big difference in ages between them. Constance had never been the owner of the Arasig estates. Her parents had owned it, then her brother, and then her sister, and then her brother-in-law, and then her niece. But it was her home. In between all of those different owners, and in between all of those adventures she recorded in her diary, that was the place that she called home. And I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about Constance. As I said, please do have a wee look at her Google Arasig estate, Arasig house, and if you have a look at Constance, you'll see a picture of her as well, which I won't be able to do for you next week when we're looking at one more diary, someone whose life is far less documented and who we have no image of at all, and another one that I just can't tell you how much I'm enjoying writing it, but we'll come back to that next week. So I hope you've enjoyed hearing a bit about Constance and the different women that we've looked at through the course of this month. I hope you can join me next week for Anne Fraser's diary. Thank you for joining me this week, and a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're really grateful for that. So thank you very much, and thanks again to Rory for his help in writing some notes for this one for me.